citizen.
Out of many
We are world citizens, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome to another episode of the People-Powered Planet podcast, where each week we bring amazing solutionaries. This is where we focus on people that are bringing us inspiring stories and inspiring ideas about how we can actually solve the problems and actually come together as a planet into what Gary called the people-powered planet. And today we have two very special people power experts, really, who've been part of that in creating an incredible film that was on television last night, on public television, on American Experience all across the country, going out to 1 million viewers. And it's called The Movement and the Madman. And let me start I will introduce Steve Ladd and Robert Levering, who are both involved in producing the program. Executive producer Robert Levering, I've known way back since my college days. So all of us have crossed paths a great deal in the anti-war movement that helped turn things around in this country in amazing ways. And it's an inspiring story we all need today to turn things around in our day. Now, let me just first say that Robert Levering has been a business journalist since 1969. And he was on the staff of the new Mobe, and he helped train about 5,000 marshals to make sure that the huge mobilization stayed nonviolent and that people were properly trained to have an impact. And I think that's one of the things that came through in the film, how this spread through Middle America. And the co-producer Steve Ladd has been both a part of the movement since very early days, War Resisters League and so on, but also and a key draft resist organizer at Berkeley. We all heard about Berkeley's role there, but he's also been focusing on helping produce and distribute documentaries, including the wonderful documentary by our friend Judith Ehrlich and her group called The Boys Who Said No. So welcome very much to our show, Steve Ladd and Robert Levering.
Great to be here with everybody.
Likewise. Thanks for inviting us.
Well, so first, let me ask you a question. Why did you call Nixon a madman?
We didn't. If you notice in the title, it's in quotes. It's Movement and the Madman in quotes, and we're not saying that he was mad. I mean, we would, if we did, we wouldn't be the first, but it's about a strategy that he had. It was the madman strategy, and the idea of it was that he was going to make himself seem so crazy that he might do all the dastardly things that he was threatening. But anyway, it was a very clearly thought out strategy. It was not something that was, spur of the moment, that he actually had developed this idea that this would work. And if you want to get into the history of it, he actually thought that this was something that, that the Korean War was ended in part, he thinks, because Eisenhower threatened nukes. And so he was essentially, picked that up, or at least that's what some of the historians say, that's where he got the idea. But at any rate, that was the idea. And so our focus is on that strategy, and we try to show how that was done.
Right. Well, that's one of the fascinating parts of the movie is that it was Nixon who called himself the madman and wanted to project the madman image.
He was hoping that that would intimidate the North Vietnamese into agreeing to end the war, basically. And he set that November 1st deadline, and you see in the film all the different options, the madman options that he was considering as part of the duck hook strategy, including the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. But there's a whole list of them in the film, which you can see, which was quite a range, and many of them would have been quite devastating. So he hoped that it would intimidate the North Vietnamese, and it didn't. and in part, as you saw in the film, because of the protests. He knew that he might lose the support of the American people if he went too far.
Well, I thought one of the fascinating parts of the movie was that it did show that, in fact, while he was publicly saying, "Oh, I'm not being affected by those protesters," wasn't he, in fact, monitoring the protest very, very closely and very, very worried? Tell us a little more about what were some of the things that what minute detail he went to in trying to combat that you showed in the film, trying to combat this anti-war movement.
Probably the most humorous one was we had what we called the March Against Death, where people we had over 40,000 people walked from Arlington Cemetery past the White House to the Capitol with candles that were lit. And he apparently, according to one of the historians on our show, Chris Oppie, that he actually suggested, well, why can't we get a helicopter to blow out the candles?
So he was obsessed with the movement while he was
Right.
publicly saying, "Oh, this won't affect my policy." In fact, it was very, very much affecting his policy. And I think the key thing is, you mentioned saying that he wanted to intimidate the Vietnamese into peace. But the interesting part is the Vietnamese never attacked America in the slightest, never came over to our country and did a single thing, never stole anything from us, never did anything to us. And we're over there pounding their country and asking them to negotiate. So tell me a little bit more about how the theory, the whole justification behind the war. What was it that they were claiming was a reason for the war, and what was the objective?
I mean, there are many, many theories about that, and
Right.
I think the most complete answer to that is in the Pentagon Papers,
Right.
because that was commissioned by Robert McNamara, and it goes through the whole history, starting in with Truman, and how the U.S. got into that particular quagmire.
That was one, by the way, of the very valuable parts of your movie. One of the most important parts was Daniel Ellsberg speaking about giving us sort of an inside story of what was going on while this was publicly being projected. Maybe Steve, do you want to jump in on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, there's a number of people who are insiders in the film, including Dan Ellsberg, and I think they all, to some extent, confirm what was going on in the White House, this madman strategy, which Dan talks about early on in the film. And he says he believes, of course, Nixon really was a madman in other ways. There's so much said about what was known from the inside and wasn't revealed. It was all secret. And it was people like Dan, of course, who eventually revealed some of the early lies about the war and what led to the war. So it's natural that he would be able to speak to this in the film, particularly about Nixon's madman strategy.
Right.
But I also want to go back to one of the things that Robert said earlier too, which is, that one of the things that I think this film shows, and that we should all realize, is that presidents or politicians are always watching and listening when protests are happening. And they don't want you to know that, of course, like Nixon didn't, but they're always listening. And so that's one of the reasons, and I think one of the key messages in this film is that it's important that you do what we need to do to try to bring peace or justice or whatever, and it doesn't always happen immediately, and you won't always know the results, but it's important, and your impact may be well beyond what you learn at the time. And that's a very significant thing, and I think one of the most important sort of ongoing, inspiring lessons about this film for activists today.
Hopefully it is having a huge impact, because so many people today do feel disempowered. They feel like geez, we try so hard, we can't make a difference. And I think the key thing that your film did is show people that we can indeed make a difference, and that we are making a difference, right?
Well-organized and broad-based protest to really make an impact. And, you hear Cora Weiss in the film say, I wanted to make sure that it would be safe for me to bring my children. And you hear earlier on too, particularly in the moratorium section, about how, newscasters were saying that it was truly reflective of America, the kind of people who were a part of these protests, which is also important. So I think those are the other kinds of, if you want to call them lessons from that area in the film, that we try to portray. That well-organized, broad-based protests, doing creative things like the moratorium, and things like that were quite significant and had quite an impact, and can have quite an impact today.
Well, I think that is absolutely crucial, and that one of the key things that the movie shows is that there were so many key organizers and leaders in the movement. Many of our good friends who came out of religious backgrounds and came out of them out of Quakerism and progressive liberal kind of religious backgrounds, and that the mobilization of clergy and of people who were concerned about keeping this, as you said, mainstream and not like some radical fringe, that this had a big impact. Tell us a little bit more about that, and about how you got people like that involved in helping to put together this story.
I mean, a lot of people are sort of curious, how did we get these former Kissinger aides involved?
Right.
And Stephen Bull, who was Nixon's personal aide, and a way I'd describe it, it was sort of like pushing on an open door. I mean, we had nobody turn us down. Everybody that we wanted to talk to was willing to talk. And so that was, I mean, we were somewhat surprised, but we didn't, but we got all the people we wanted to talk. We wanted to have insiders, White House insiders. Of course, we wanted to have all of the people that were, the organizers that are still living of the moratorium and the Mobe, and lots of ordinary folks who were involved in it. But and historians, of course, we had historians, and also we had we interviewed two Congress people, McCloskey and Regal. And Regal's in the film. He's at the very end of the film where he talks about how it was essentially the people on the streets who are what pushed Congress to be able to, actually literally end the war. So, okay, that's my answer to that. I don't know, did you want to ask David something?
Well, David is an old friend of mine. We were active way back. When I was a high school student, he was very inspiring to me, coming through Washington, D.C. on the San Francisco to Moscow Peace March. And he's been a key person in starting the Nonviolent Peace Force and starting World Beyond War. And it's just really a key mover and shaker in the whole movement. But one of the things that I felt was so exciting, I felt you were also at the key turning point of the movie. Here we were with the administration bringing out all their forces to say, oh, Middle America is against this, and we're all putting, this is all this fringe and everything. And then there was a fascinating scene where you were on the steps of the Capitol, where people were reading off the names of all of the war dead. And what happened when you spoke to Congressman Brown there about that?
Well, we'd been arrested, I think, for 2 or 3 weeks each Wednesday for reading the names. And I knew Congressman George Brown because my job was working as a Quaker lobbyist against the war. And so I went to see him, and he really looked the typical politician. He was in a swivel chair with a cigar, and I just said, well, George, this is what's happening to us. We're getting arrested every week. Can you help us? And he took a puff on a cigar and leaned back on his chair and said, "Yeah, I think I'll join you. And furthermore, I'll write to every member of Congress, inviting them to join us." And this was a Tuesday afternoon. So he I said, "Well, that's fantastic." So the next day at 12 o'clock, we're out there reading the names, and here were three congressmen that were there with us. I mean, as you know from the film, after we were arrested again, the ordinary Quakers, the congressman continued reading all the names of the American soldiers that had died, which went on for hours and hours. And that inspired, and then in succeeding weeks, there were many other members of Congress that also joined us. But that inspired I feel our courage inspired the congressmen to do what they felt was right, and their courage gave courage to the media to begin really addressing this issue of even congressmen are out there risking getting arrested. And then what we had done, which was not just the ordinary demonstration, we were reading the names of all the soldiers that had been killed. And within weeks, literally in more than 100 towns across the country, people were reading the names of the war dead at the congressman's office, at city halls, at military bases. And so it was inspiring. And my interaction with the moratorium leaders, that was really inspiring, the amount of the energy and the persistence they had. And I agreed to get the members of Congress to do an all-night talkathon. This wasn't in the film. A speak out against the war, starting at, I don't know, 9 o'clock in the night. And we had 24 members of Congress that each would take an hour. And speaking about why we have to end this war and bring the troops home. And so we were prepared for 24 hours until 9 o'clock the next morning. And unfortunately, some of the pro-war people had the ear of the speaker, and about 1 a.m., something like that, closed off the Congress for the night. But and the reason we did that was the night before the moratorium, was to get some publicity about members of Congress speaking out against the war, and that would make it more acceptable for ordinary folks to get out and act the next day. So some of the lessons I see, I heard what Steve said, which I totally agree with, but we need hope, we need courage, we need creativity, not just doing the same old thing, persistence, sustained action, commitment to nonviolence, and a belief that we can make a difference. I think the hopelessness of a lot of people is a major problem. And I guess the final thing is reaching out across the country. I mean, this wasn't just on the coast. This was Podunk, Idaho, and so forth. And that's critical. And so we don't just talk with the people that are already on our side. We reach out far and wide.
That's very inspiring, and I think you were obviously played a key role in doing that. And I think what were some of the other ways that this that you saw the movement having the foresight to mobilize different constituencies. It comes through in the film a little bit, but you're getting labor, you're getting religious groups, you're getting such a wide range of people from across every part of the political spectrum into this. How did that end up really increasing the impact, and what lesson does that have for today for how we can grow our impact?
Well, I mean, the leadership of the moratorium had the connections on university campuses across the country, to the key people in the religious community, to local peace groups. I mean, I forget her name, but the woman from Ball State, Indiana, sounded like she started out as a single person. I mean, one person starting a peace group there, but they ended up organizing something. So I think we need to broaden our perspective to really who are our potential allies. And there's a lot of Republicans, by the way, that are more opposing more funds to Ukraine and more funds for the war than there are Democrats, because we have a Democratic president. So I think we need to make alliances with all the people that are hurting. I think the Poor People's Campaign is an example of people that are not just fighting militarism, but fighting economic injustice and who are hurting. And the environmental movement, I think the environmental movement is something that is grassroots all across the country. I mean, all across the world. And of course, the environmental movement and the military and wars are very related. And if we have a nuclear war, there's not going to be much of an environment left. I mean, we need to reach out to those folks and listen. I mean, I think listening is certainly another very important ingredient of where people are at and looking at what we have in common in terms of building a powerful movement.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to say for the record that I took Arthur to his first peace demonstration back when he was in high school. So I'm proud of that.
Thank you, David. I so appreciate that. Yeah, David's a fantastic impact on my life and so many people, but he's also just been a nonstop activist for building a better world. So certainly hats off to David, and you've managed to come through great challenges and going. So we just love it. Do either of you, Steve or Robert, want to comment on what David was saying?
One thing that sort of coming somewhat off of what David was saying, that one of the things I think you see a little bit in this film is that one movement can influence another. So what had been going on with the civil rights movement had an enormous impact, I think, on the anti-war movement and how it organized. And you saw some of the civil rights leaders, of course, at some of the rallies and involved in other ways. And, the movement influencing another, a lot of the people like myself and others, and even in the film, involved in the anti-war movement, went on to, organize in other movements like the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s, and learned the lessons from the anti-war movement and, other causes we've been involved with. So that's one other thing I think that's important. And one of the, reasons I think this film is important, so that people today can learn from this movement, which may to younger people seem like ancient history, but hopefully in the way the film was done too, without showing all the old people on camera, may help to, inspire young people, younger activists especially, to, to learn from what we did back in the 60s and take it today and turn it into, their own thing, whatever they need to do today to really make a difference.
Well, I love that you made a conscious decision not to show us old folks on camera, but to get the voices in there so that you can make the point and not have people say, oh, yeah, that's those old guys, but help them feel like it's theirs and something that's current for them. And I think it was so important that you mentioned that this helped feed into the strategy of the nuclear freeze movement, because we've had on our podcast both the director of The Day After, and who also made several of the Star Trek movies, and Dan Ellsberg, and we've had many people on the nuclear issue. And in fact, it was very clear in a similar kind of story where President Reagan was actually believing his generals that he could fight and win a nuclear war, and The Day After and the whole freeze movement and so on finally, especially The Day After, shook him up and convinced him that nuclear war was unwinnable and that he had to start reducing arms. And that was actually a key time where we stepped back from the Bolton atomic scientist clock that was inching us. I think it was a couple of minutes from a midnight of destruction of life on this planet, that we stepped back from that and actually moved to an era where there was the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. But now we're edging very close to nuclear war again, with it now being 90 seconds to a midnight of unbelievable destruction. How does telling the story of the war? Well, I know you had an interesting quote about wars are fought twice. Maybe give us that quote and tell us how does the telling of this story help provide us with key solutions for today?
Well, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote The Sympathizer and other novels and so on, another one of his books, he starts it off saying that all wars are fought twice, once on the battlefield, and secondly, in memory. And a point that I've, or the way I would say that we've dealt with the Vietnam War, at least the side of the war that the anti-war movement was on, in many ways, and I think our film shows this, won the battle on the battlefield, the battlefield of public opinion and political pressure on Congress and so on. But we've essentially done nothing, or virtually nothing, in terms of memory. That we have, while we've done our own ceasefire, the other side, and by the other side, I mean, the Pentagon, by essentially putting Vietnam vets on a pedestal, that the POW issue and the old poor vets, that the whole thing of, and then the media with all the awful films about Vietnam, that depict, the Rambo movies, and even the, like Forrest Gump. The depiction of the anti-war movement has been almost totally one of, stoned out hippies and, just a complete, caricature of what was the reality of it. And then just in terms of movies, there've been virtually none. I mean, there have been a few, like Steve Ladd and I were involved with The Boys Who Said No, which was about the draft resistance movement. And there's a fabulous movie about the GI movement, the Sir No Sir, or Sir No Sir. But the overall anti-war movement, this is the first one. This is the first one that actually tells the story from the point of view, well, not just the point of view, but tells the story that really depicts the broad cross-section of the anti-war movement in a, if not favorable light, at least a more accurate depiction. And and you could even look at, let's say, like the Ken Burns series, 18 hours. I would say half of it, maybe, I don't know, I never did try to figure it out, but at least half of it was on the battlefield, battle after battle after bloody battle. And I think that it was a tremendous anti-war movement movie in the sense that it showed how awful war is, but it did not, the very few anti-war people that were on were, even had a couple of them apologizing, for things, like, I don't know, I should slow down here, but I'll just mention one thing. But one of the women who was, an anti-war person, who was a, valid, good anti-warrior, she even apologized for the, spitting on the troops, returning troops. Now, this was, if it happened, and there's a big if here, it was extremely isolated. In fact, there's a really good book by Jerry Lemke called The Spitting Image, which he, an academic who systematically went around to try to find out the truth of this. And he saw that it was basically not, it was basically rumors that, somebody heard about it. He tried to track down somebody who had actually happened to it. It was very hard to find. He couldn't find anybody that it actually happened to. It was more like, well, I heard about it. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that is out there. And the reality was that the anti-war movement was, in terms of its relationship with the returning troops, was one of open arms. And VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, was, a good testament to that. There were thousands, I don't know, David, I don't know how many, 25,000 or so, and then Veterans for Peace. I mean, they were huge movements, and that was hardly, and that's very, pretty much forgotten.
Well, I love what you said. It's so valuable. And, it's so important, the story of the war. And you're right. In fact, the warrior side, it was totally proved, all the reasons for the war, well, proved lies. I mean, there was going to be a domino. If Vietnam fell, as they called it, actually rose, if it fell, then there would be dominoes, and all the others in Southeast Asia would fall to communism. That this was Chinese communism coming through. And what actually happened? None of the things that they said happened when Vietnam rose. In fact, Vietnamese have still, even despite the war, as we've had with heard in some of our podcasts here, have stayed, wonderful friends of America, and there hasn't been any of the kind of things that they claimed would happen if we didn't beat them in Vietnam. Again, people who never did anything to us, and here we are fighting them in their country and calling that self-defense. I mean, it's very interesting that we haven't framed the story in a way that favors the anti-war movement, because certainly the facts all do. So I appreciate very much your saying that, and I also appreciate your mentioning that the people in the GI movement were met with open arms. I mean, I was part of the Winter Soldier investigation, where soldiers were testifying about the horrible things that had happened, and they were embraced by and totally helped with the movement. And that might be a good time for us to bring Melanie in, because she was part of promoting a film that related to that issue, and maybe she would come in to see that, take some of the questions we're having as we continue this discussion. Melanie, do you want to jump in a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much. The film Arthur is mentioning is called Captain Milkshake, and you can get that online. It's a story of a peace activist who meets and falls in love with a Marine. So it's a feature film, beautifully done, incredibly well shot, and beautiful story. And I was hoping it would make people realize the power of the people, that yes, we can do that. And that's what I love about this film. Thank you so much, Steve and Robert, and David, for your participation in the film, and also David, your advice that we can do this, that and motivating and we getting people involved in, like you said, all walks of life, Robert, and that's not really shown. And you're right, this is the first film I've seen where there's so many different voices that were in the anti-war movement. So thank you, all of you. Thank you. And thank you, Arthur, for the work you've been doing. And this is incredible. We're so glad we have some great people here as well. And the first one to go for a question is Richard. So Richard, if you could go right ahead, question or comment.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you, Arthur, for bringing us all together. And definitely thank you to Steve and Robert for this film. It's excellent. I think the power of film, as you've mentioned, Arthur, the day after, and certainly, hopefully this one too will change people's minds. So want to thank you for that. Two questions. One is, what is the situation today? People are saying that Putin is a madman, and he brought the troops on the border of Ukraine and said he wasn't going to invade, and then he invaded. And now he's saying that he will use nuclear weapons if there's an attack on Crimea. He's moving them into Belarus. And a lot of people say that, yes, he's a madman, but in the same breath, they say, no, he's not that crazy to use nuclear weapons. So that's the first question. The second question is that your movie was excellent. Can we replicate the movement today? And I'm looking at the environment, our young people who are involved in the environment, and how to get them involved in the anti-nuclear movement, and thinking that in one sense it might be simpler today in that we have social media that can get the message out. Your comments.
I'll take your second question. I'm not an expert in the psychology of Vladimir Putin. Maybe somebody else could take that one. But as far as the second part of your question was, I think that, I mean, at the time of the, 1969, those two demonstrations, the moratorium and the mobilization, were the largest political demonstrations in American history. By far. It's one of the TV commentators says that in the film. Much larger, for instance, than the March on Washington in '63. But by far, I mean, but it was eclipsed by in what was it, '84, the nuclear freeze. Just in terms of a single, I mean, it wasn't as large as the moratorium, but it was larger than the mobilization. But even more recently, the Women's March right after Trump was elected was larger. And the George Floyd demonstrations 3 years ago were, I mean, 20 million people estimated by some people actually participated in all kinds of places all over the country. So it's not like, can it be recreated? I mean, it's already been recreated. I mean, there is the I mean, it's way beyond what was possible then. I think particularly, back in the 60s, we had to use, telephone, leaflets run off in the mimeograph machines. We had very rudimentary ways of getting the word out. Now it's it's instantaneous. But at any rate, that's I think that, well, and you could also look at, I mean, not here right now, but in Israel, the people on the streets stopped. I'll put in quotes a madman from going through with his ideas, but it's really, it's something that's happened. And I know David knows a lot more about this, about, the power of the people, that this is all over the world. This is, it's really caught on. Erica Chenoweth is, a researcher from Harvard, has really documented a lot of this, that the power of, people is just much stronger than it's ever been. And that we should not look back nostalgically at what went on in the 60s, and what I think what our film is trying to do is to, use what happened in the 60s as an inspiration, not as a bit of nostalgia. Anyway, I don't know, Steve.
American Experience wrote the film is about the power of protest, or the potential power of protest. But the kind of protest that would be done, or movements that would be needed for each issue, can obviously vary quite a bit. And so there isn't one formula necessarily, but obviously the more you can build a broader base of support and show it, the more likely you are to have an impact. And that was true with the nuclear freeze movement as well. We really made a point of, and I think also just being clear, what are you trying to accomplish? And, being clear as possible and as simple as possible about what your goal is that you're organizing people around. And using a variety of tactics to build as broad a base as possible. The nuclear freeze movement, I think as many of you probably know, used local statewide initiatives to show that there was broad support for basically ending the nuclear arms race. So it involved millions of people going out and actually voting on the issue. So there are a variety of things that can be done, to have an impact. And we can't really dictate, for each movement, but there's certainly some things to learn from this film, and obviously from what's gone on before.
Related to your comment about Putin being a madman, which I think most politicians are, when they, on all sides, when they talk about using nuclear weapons, which is total madness. But I think a common thing between Vietnam and all the other wars we've been fighting is almost always they're based on lies. Big lies. And the media is totally complicit in mouthing those lies that the political leaders tell. And if you look at the past, Noriega, Saddam Hussein, all these people, they were the new Hitler. And so we had to mobilize every energy we've got. Now it's Putin. And the media has got the American people into a war frenzy.
Exactly.
And they've shown the horrors of what the Russians are doing every night, which they never did in Iraq. But at any rate, I think in response to that, so I think we don't take what the politicians and the media tell us as truth. And in order to try to get the truth out, we've got to be very creative. We've got to be sustained in our action, and find ways to try to counter those lies, which get us deeper, which are getting us to the very dangerous risk of nuclear war.
Thank you, David. Yes, manipulation, it seems to work on us. And we just have to remember that generally people don't like war, and you can demonize anybody. Anybody can be demonized. So, okay, so now I'd like to have Robin make her comment. Robin, go right ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so this was really thrilling to watch, and like many of others of you there, of a certain age, you were probably involved in this. I was at the moratorium and so on, and loved seeing the how it was put together. But I have a concern, which is that I think the film deserves some kind of postscript, because I was expecting to see or hear, well, of course I didn't have emails time, but more revealing letters about about Nixon deciding not to nuke Vietnam. And the fact is that although the moratorium may have put off the destruction of Vietnam a little bit, unfortunately, for some reason, and you don't go into it at all, and it's not your subject, but he got elected again, and then he launched the most intensive air offensive of the war in December of '72. So, I mean, he didn't give up on destroying Vietnam. He put it off for a while, and I think your film should acknowledge that.
Okay. Do you want a response on that?
I'd love to hear your
Sure.
response.
Well, you can only do so much in 90 minutes, and in this case, 82. And we had to make a lot of choices. Now, we actually did have an epilogue at one point, and we got rid of it because we thought it detracted. Ours was, trying to tell a story, and we decided to tell the story of what happened in '69. Now, one of the things that we do say, and it's said by several people in the film, is that the war did go on, and that the destruction did go on, and people did keep getting killed. But the fact is, why did the war actually end? The war actually ended because Congress put an end to it. I mean, if you actually look at what happened, the Congress passed in '73, it passed a number, 72, 73, it passed a number of things that limited, actually withdrew the funds for, anything further to be used in, initially Laos and Cambodia, and then in Vietnam itself. And that was the overall point that we really wanted to make, was that was a direct result of the movement, that the Congress did it. Now, Congress did not put an end to Afghanistan, did not put an end to Iraq. And that's the difference. Okay. Just one other, I'm sorry for taking so much time, but one other really important thing is that that I'm really proud that we made clear in the film that nonviolence was central to the success of the movement. And that that's why we were able to reach out to so many people, and that's why it had the impact it did. Okay, that's put in my Quaker nonviolence hat.
That's great. Steve, anything to add before we go?
Well, I think the other impacts from particularly '69 and on was, Nixon, and I think one of the reasons he was reelected was because he withdrew most of the American troops from Vietnam. So it became, he instituted the lottery in December of 1969. He did a lot to undercut American anger about the war, the American public's anger about the war, without actually ending the war. But eventually, as Robert said, Congress did vote to end it. And in fact, today, March 29th, is the 50th anniversary of the withdrawal of the final US combat troops from Vietnam. So it took I think there were 10,000 left at this point, something like that. So it took, a number of years, but over time it ended. It ended more slowly than we would have liked, with more deaths than we would have liked, but the movement did have an impact. And as Robert says, the film highlights in particular this one period of time and the impact it had at that moment to restrain the president. And I think even though he took other actions later, like you were describing, Christmas bombings and so forth, I think they were far less destructive than he had outlined in the duck hook strategy.
Okay, now we only have 5 minutes for 2 questions, and Quanta, quickly, if you would, please.
Thank you. I did watch it and I really appreciate your work. It's really wonderful. What I was thinking during the whole time is how can we replicate that kind of unity where, you know, you had variety of sectors of society coming together against the war. But I think that today we have some challenges. I don't know, we are more polarized than we were then, but I think we can make a connection between the military spending and the threat of nuclear war to the poverty and the young people not having the means for education and things like that. So they have to understand that there's a connection between military spending and their lack of assistance because the money is spending more on the military. But I also think that just protesting isn't enough. For it to be sustainable, we have to get together and have the legislators sponsor a bill to reduce their spending and also appropriate funding for peace education in schools as well, and or even given to the peace organizations to educate the public as well. So that's what I wanted to share. And what do you think about what are the challenges and what are the pros and cons for us doing that right now?
I'll just point out that in the film, Frank Joyce says at one point, you know, if you can't stand 18-hour meetings, you know, you're not ready to be in the movement. It was not easy to get such a broad coalition. It was tough. It's very, very difficult. You have to be willing to have lots and lots of conversations. And, you know, you can't just sort of take a position and then that's that. You know, it's easy to be in a bubble and you know, where everybody agrees, but you have, you know, when you have a lot of different viewpoints, it takes a lot of energy to do it. But it's possible, but it does take that. And that's what Steve, I don't know, David looks like he's wanted to say something.
Well, just to reiterate what's been said before, and I know personally because I was working with Congress starting in 1966, when there were, I think, 2 members of Congress that voted against the authorization of force for Vietnam. But Congress will only move if there's a broad-based movement out there demanding that they move. And there is legislation right now proposing a $100 billion cut in the military budget. But that's only going to go somewhere if people throughout this country that are hurting and that have a moral conscience and have a different vision of how we can get security than bombing people, get out in the streets and build a sustained movement as we had in the, you know, during the Vietnam days.
Thank you, David. You're so knowledgeable. Okay, I guess we could do a quick, Bud, hurry.
Yeah. I was fortunate to spend a little bit of time with Claiborne Pell, the senator, senior ranking senator from the state of Rhode Island on the Foreign Relations Committee at the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And I asked him directly, privately, he had no reason to not tell me the truth, what really brought the Vietnam War to an end. And he didn't even hesitate. He immediately said, over 1 million people took to the streets. And that was it. And that was his answer. And there was no backroom smoke-filled deal made, not whatsoever. And but what I'm concerned about now is that millions and millions of people are taking to the streets, but with the mentality of embedded media, for example, covering wars, and the arrogance of our elected officials now seem to be insulated from and ignore public opinion that shows up with millions of people in the street. So the question might be, how do we make those voices and that phenomenon have any traction that is can be measured by the response from elected officials? Does they seem to ignore it?
I'll just give a quick answer. Our film points out that what you're saying is exactly what we said at the time. We're not having any effect. We're not having any impact whatsoever. We didn't know what was going on inside the White House. Now we do. We don't assume that you're not having an impact. You know, as Frank Joyce says, you know, you may not know now, you may not know in a week, you may not know in a decade, but
Yeah,
you
I
are
got
having an impact. And I think that's the thing to remind ourselves, because it's very easy to get cynical and depressed and discouraged, and we just
Sure.
have to keep moving forward.
That is a perfect way to excellent. Thank you so much. Beautiful, so hopeful. And quickly to Arthur to close. Arthur.
Let me add one pitch, if I can, just that the film is, I think, as many of you know, now available to view online for free on the American Experience website. And we really encourage sharing it as widely as possible, particularly with younger generation, but everybody really should see this film and hopefully be inspired by it. And I did put a link to our website in the chat, which has also the link to the American Experience website to view it, but also other resources and other information about the film and the filmmakers. So you might want to visit that, and also be sure to sign up on our email list too for future news about the film.
Well, I would love to talk about this for so much more time. There's so many fascinating things to say, and you can do that next week when we have our club social, where we can all get together and talk more about all the things we didn't get to cover or chat with then. And then the following week, we have a really phenomenal guest. We have Medea Benjamin, who is, she was described by New York Newsday as America's most committed and effective fighter for human rights, and by Los Angeles Times as one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement. So many of you know her. She's been so active with Code Pink, and she has a wonderful book out, The War in Ukraine, that answers many of the questions we were talking about what motivated and led to what Putin is doing and so on. And it's absolutely true that the media seems to love to create we're never fighting a country, we're never killing the people of this country. It's always we're fighting a Hitler or a Putin or whoever it is. And it always seems they have all the justifications that all fall through, when really what we crucially need is a vision of how the world comes together above these nations that are dividing us. And that's what a world Dave is talking about, and the vision, and that's what we're working on with The World Is My Country, and a vision of how we come together and leave these wars in the dust, so that wars become obsolete and a thing of to put in the history books or the museums. So in any case, do keep joining us every week, where we talk about how we can begin to solve these problems and how we can create that vision of a world that works. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Join us this week and every week on the People Powered Planet podcast. And everybody do get word about that film out to everyone, so they can all watch it on, as you said, on American Experience. We all need this film to empower us to carry on.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.